Hi everybody, this is a video from Miss Duckle's classroom. This is the second part to the how to answer a literature extract question. So the first part was how to approach the question, how to look at the extract and analyse the extract, and how to select the points that you want to use for your plan. So today we are going to be looking at how to write up your answer. So in the last lesson, we covered what you can say about Jean's fear and how it's presented. We looked at the different quotations that you could select for your evidence. And we also tried to look at the various techniques that you could comment on. So remember, we did this as we went through the extract. Trying to annotate as you go is always going to be beneficial in terms of your timing. We made notes on some analysis in terms of what we can then say when we write up the full answer. And then we made a clear plan. So just to remind you for timing, I said you should roughly spend about 15 minutes going through the extract, annotating, and then making a plan. That leaves you 30 minutes to write up your answer. That's why it's important that you make as many notes as you go through when you're initially looking at the extract. And then all you're really doing is pulling together all of your ideas in an essay format. So just in case, we need a quick reminder of what you're being tested on so you can keep it in your mind as we start to write up the answer. There are 4 different assessment objectives. So what we really want to be showing when we write up the body of the answer is that you have a good understanding of the extract, what is happening, who is involved, that you are selecting relevant quotations, that there's a lot that you can say about them, and that you're inferring and you're interpreting meaning. You also want to have a very good focus on any techniques. As this is the extract part of the question, you are of course required to do deep analysis and to show that you understand just how language is used to create meaning, and also a variety of different structural techniques. You must also show that you understand why. Why have they been presented in this way? What is the author's intention? What is the author trying to show you? What effect does the author want to have on you? And the last one, AO4, is mostly to do with how you now write up your ideas. So you must present your ideas in a coherent and relevant way, and you must develop your own personal response in terms of the question. So the examiner wants to see how you are responding to the question and how you are finding evidence to support your own views. So this is the plan that I made last lesson. And what we're going to do is, as I said last time, you may have a variety of different ideas on your plan, and then when you come to write it up, you may decide on some that you think are stronger or that you think you can talk about in detail. For the purpose of today, I've picked setting, Jean's actions and how he describes these, and what he says. They are probably the stronger ones and the ones that I know I've got clear evidence for, and also the ones where I know I've got a lot to say about the quotations. So in terms of how you write up your answer, that what, how, why approach is actually really useful and hugely beneficial when it comes to showing that you can create a personal response and that your response can be developed and analytical in order for you to hit AO4. So if we start off with the what. The what is, what do you learn? So what do you learn from the extract? What do you learn about the characters? What do you learn about the actions or the settings? What is it that stands out for you? Remember that the examiner has picked this extract for a particular reason. So there is something significant or poignant about this extract. So what is it that stands out for you? What do you think is shown in terms of characters or relationships or events or the setting? What is the significance of what you see? And then what is your evidence to support this? So a lot of the what's here relate to your point. So what is the point that you want to make? And then what is the evidence that supports your point? Then we move on to the how. How do you learn this? So whatever you've said over here for the what, how do you know? How is it shown? This refers to technique, style, method. So what has the author done in order for you to understand that Jean is scared or Jean is paranoid? And the third one, the why. Why is it shown in this way? So why is Jean presented as being scared through the use of a simile? Why a simile? Or why this particular word? This all links to author intention. So what effect is the author trying to have on you? What message is the author trying to convey? What are they trying to show you? What do they want you to understand? So if you can just bear the what, how, why in your mind as you move through your essay, and even maybe jot it down on a scrap piece of paper in your exam, just to remind yourself of the steps you need to go through in order to build an effective essay. So this is something that I find quite useful, and I like to use it in my own lessons. It's a paragraph pyramid, or it could be a paragraph. Sometimes this may even move into 2 paragraphs, depending on how long your section is. So don't be afraid to move into 2 paragraphs, even if you are still discussing one main point. So if we look at the paragraph, we obviously start off with the smaller sentence. So you may have 1 or 2 sentences in terms of your point. And this is where you directly relay back to the question. This is where you're answering the question. You're responding to the question based upon what you've learned in the extract. The second thing we have here is the evidence. So which quotation backs up your point? What are you using? Don't forget that you should be introducing your quotation and embedding it. Number 3 on the pyramid is your first response to this evidence. So initially, what does the evidence show? So superficially, what do we see? What's explicit? So you could use phrases such as "this suggests," "this implies," the use of "reveals." We see that. Your second response, this is where you're now trying to take it a little bit further. You're trying to develop your interpretation. So you can develop by layering your analysis. This is where you make an initial response and then you add on something extra. So in addition, this simile could also convey. Furthermore, the use of this verb could also suggest. You can also double up on techniques. So this is a phrase that I often use in my teaching, and it simply means to use 2 or even more techniques. So if you begin by talking about a simile, but you also notice that it's a short sentence, then you can also talk about how these 2 techniques work together to create an effect. So once you've spoken about your techniques, how does it reinforce your point? So you don't get any extra marks for merely naming techniques. You must say why this simile has been used, why this short sentence has been used. So what does it reveal about the character, their relationships with other people, their relationship even with themselves or their action? You can then further develop by analysing language. So if there's a word that stands out or that is particularly interesting, zoom in on this word. Discuss the connotations. What kind of word is it? Can you even say that it's an aggressive verb or it's an interesting adjective? So what are these words? What are the connotations? Why have they been chosen? How do they reinforce the initial point? Because we always must remember to come back to here. Whatever point you make up here, please don't lose this as you start to go through your paragraph. Make sure everything is relevant. Make sure you're getting your marks for AO4. And here we have the final layer in your paragraph or in your pyramid. And this is where, if you can, you try and develop further. So you try and extend upon what you've already said. Try add something in addition. Some of your options here are writer intention. So what is Knowles trying to show you? What does he want you to understand? How does he want you to feel? And why? The effect on the reader. The context, if relevant. So please don't bolt on additional contextual information. If it enhances your point, adds clarity to your point, adds meaning, or helps your interpretation, then by all means add it in. You can use these words and phrases. So perhaps the writer, this idea could be linked to, this forces the reader to. So at all times throughout your essay, it's useful to maybe have a bank of these key phrases to help you. It makes your writing sound a little bit more academic. It also helps with the fluency of your expression. Okay, so now I just want to quickly go over how you develop your written analysis. So again, you can see we've gone back to the what, the how, and the why. So when you're talking about technique or language, please try and go through these different steps, because this will help you to develop your writing, but also it shows the examiner that you've got a good understanding of the methods that a writer may choose to use and why. Don't forget that everything that you say must link back to the question, your initial point that you made to begin this paragraph or section, and also try and link everything back to the author intention. Try not to forget that this is a novel, the reason why it's been written, what it's been written about, and what Knowles ultimately wants you to think or feel or understand. So when we have the technique, remember to name the technique, what technique has been used, and then start to develop the effectiveness of this technique. So why has it been used? What does it show? What is the effect? How does it reinforce the message of what Knowles is trying to show you? How does it reinforce or maybe reflect some of the themes? And again, try and double up, as I mentioned before. It's the same for the language. So what words stand out? Why have they been used? What's the effect? How do these particular words reinforce the message? And again, how do they reflect the theme? So particular words may have connotations that link to conflict, or that link to growing up or adolescence, or they even link to war imagery. So all of that is useful in commenting on. Okay, so now let's look specifically at one of the points from the plan I did earlier. So the first point that I would speak about would be setting. And the reason for this is because it's actually the first thing that I highlighted in the extract. So when I go back to the extract in order to decide what I'm going to write about, I noticed that actually this is the first thing, and it's always going to be easy for you if you do approach this in chronological order. So all I did, I went back to the extract. The first thing I highlighted was setting. This is the first thing that I'm now going to talk about. So this is the quotation that I particularly like. Now, with your answers for each paragraph or section, or peel, if that's how your teacher explains it to you, you can use one quotation or you can use multiple. So the choices is completely yours. So sometimes the pupils like to have maybe 2 or 3 quotations that actually all reflect the same point. But for the purpose of this right now, I'm just going to show you what we do with one quotation. Now, if you notice on the right-hand side here, I've just given you some of those phrases that I was talking about in terms of making your writing a little bit more academic. So think about these phrases as we go through this quotation. Think about maybe how you would use them. So the first thing that we're going to do, based upon what I just explained on the previous slide, is which words stand out. So when you have your quotation, you're going to be looking specifically for something that you can comment on in detail. So it's a technique or it's language. For now, we're just going to start with language. So if you think about which word stands out, hopefully you've all picked the word dungeon. So dungeon stands out obviously because it's unusual. They are boys at school. They haven't actually gone down to a dungeon. So it's an interesting choice of words. So this is where I'm going to begin in terms of what I want to talk about. So once we've identified the interesting word, we're going to think about what kind of word is it, and if there is a technique. Now we do have a technique here, and it's a simile. So that's now the first thing that I'm going to talk about when I start to build a paragraph or a section around this. Then you want to ask yourself, okay, what are the connotations of this interesting word that I have found? And obviously connotations are what you think of, what the word implies to you. And we could have something like this suggests terror or punishment, pain. It does remind you of somewhere that is dark or underground. It does have links to a prison, or it could suggest that something is hidden. So we may not mention all of these words, but they do just help you in terms of how you're interpreting the language choices. Then we want to think about why it's been used. So notice how we are going through the what, we're going through the how, we're going through the why. So we want to link everything back to the question when we're saying why it's been used. So the question, remember up here, is how does Knowles powerfully present Jean's fear in this section of the novel? So we could argue that this represents Jean's hidden self, because we've got down here that connotations of something being hidden when we think of dungeon. Maybe it implies that he's suffering due to his actions. So again, over here we had punishment, we had pain. So we can make this link to suffering. And also notice how I'm trying here to use some of these academic essay writing phrases. So we have represent here, and we have implies, and we also have suggest. So try and use these words as much as you can. And then the last one, we want to link back to the question. We want to prove to the examiner that we are, everything that we're saying is relevant, and we haven't kind of gone off on a tangent in terms of what we're talking about. So we go back to the question. This reveals his anxiety about what he did to Finney, or it could effectively convey his fear of being discovered. Now, don't think that you must just repeat the word fear maybe 7 or 10 times in your essay. You can also think about synonyms to do with fear. Anxiety is very closely related to fear, so all of this is still relevant. Okay, So if you just think about these steps, then this will effectively help you to build upon your analysis and to build an effective paragraph when you're writing your answer. Okay, so let's look at an example. Let's see what an essay looks like when it's all put together. Now, just want to remind you, so down the side, we've got the criteria that we're trying to address. And down here, I've also got a checklist for you. So your checklist for yourself should be, do you have focus on the question? Do you have relevant quotation, which is introduced and embedded? So introduced is when you set the scene of what's happening. So it's clear to the examiner, maybe who is speaking, who they're speaking to, what is happening, what they're doing and why, where it is. And if you embed a quotation, then it becomes as part of your sentence. We want an initial explanation of what the quotation shows, and then we're going to develop it. Then we're going to have our analysis of technique or language, hopefully interpretation of meaning, and then perhaps we can link to author intention and context. Now we start off here with a mini introduction. Please don't worry too much about your introduction. All you want to do is just give a brief overview of the extract and show that you understand why it's significant or why it's interesting. So we have, in this extract, Knowles powerfully presents Jean's fear through the setting of the butt room, as well as by describing Jean's actions and thoughts. This extract is particularly powerful as it comes after Finney's fall and demonstrates just how much Jean has been affected by the event. Now, hopefully you've noticed that we've got the keywords from the question here in the introduction, just to make sure the examiner knows that everything we're about to say is relevant. And it gives a brief overview of the placement of the extract and why it's important. So let's move on to the first point. The extract begins with a description of the setting. So notice how I mentioned about perhaps trying to order your essay in chronological order. So this is also structure. So I'm talking about the structure of something, why it's at the beginning and the effect of maybe it being at the beginning. The extreme description of a usually mundane room in the basement reveals the extent of Jean's internal anxiety over his own actions. So here we have a focus on the question, but this is also clearly the point. This is the point that this pupil is now going to speak about. And we have this link back to fear or anxiety. Jean describes the butt room as something like a dungeon. So here we have a relevant quotation that is embedded in the sentence. The use of this simile is interesting as it shows the extent to which Jean's mind has been affected by his actions towards Finney. So notice we have the naming of the technique, but then we also have here just a brief explanation. It shows the extent to which Jean's mind has been affected by his actions towards Finney. And then you would be expected to carry on your analysis, which is effectively what the rest of this section does. So note we have a linking phrase here to indicate to the examiner that we're about to build on what we've already said. In addition, the use of the word dungeon accurately reflects Jean's inner turmoil, as it suggests he is in a dark place and is suffering. Now, if you remember, these are some of the words that I already brainstormed around the quotation on the previous slide. So if you did have time to do some brief analysis and annotation during your planning stage, then you can just pull all of these ideas together and all you're doing is placing them into sentences. Furthermore, so good use of connectives here again, it shows that we're going to be adding on to what we've already said. Furthermore, the use of dungeon could also foreshadow what is to come later in the extract, as he's treated almost like a prisoner when he's interrogated by the other boys. So here we're interpreting, and this is a clear example of a personal response, of you trying to think about why something has been done and then explaining that. It is possible that Knowles uses this imagery to suggest that even though Jean has tried to block out or bury his guilt, he won't be successful as he's now venturing into his personal dungeon and risks being exposed. So this is fantastic interpretation of meaning, and it also links back to author intention, trying to think about what Knowles is trying to do or what he's trying to show you. And notice how even though this is one paragraph, the point is not finished, and this is okay. Just because you are writing one point or one peel, for example, it doesn't mean that everything must be in one paragraph. In addition to this, The furniture in the book room is described as being mutilated. So this is what I was talking about earlier in terms of sometimes you may decide that you want to add a second quotation because it really supports your initial point. So you would not have to include multiple quotations, but this actually fits quite nicely. And it's all together at the beginning of the extract, and it's still all to do with the setting. So it actually feeds in quite nicely. So don't be afraid to join similar quotations together if you think that they support each other and they support your point. So we have this relevant quotation here. And again, you do not have to include the full sentence. You can just merely take the words that are relevant for you. And it is embedded. So it's introduced. We're talking about furniture. We know where it is. And then this quotation is embedded as part of your sentence. The fact that Jean chooses such aggressive language, so here we're commenting on a technique, could represent the fear he has over Finney and the injury that he has suffered. So again, we've got a link back to the question here. Knowles may be trying to suggest that Jean's fear over his actions have affected him as much as Finney's fall has affected him. As this description of the setting precedes the action later, it is clear that Knowles is trying to reflect the mood of Jean and the boys through the dark and inhospitable setting. So we have reference again to what we think Knowles is trying to show. And we also have a discussion of the structure here, as this description of the setting precedes the action later. So we're talking about how Knowles has structured this particular scene or event and why we think that has happened. So if you have looked back at the checklist, we've done all of these things so far. Not so much mention of context yet, but we'll see what the rest of the essay is like. So this is part 2 of the essay. So now we're moving on to an additional point. So note how we're now again talking about structure. As the extract progresses, we are able to see how Jean's panic manifests itself in his actions. So this is now our second point. The examiner now knows we're no longer talking about setting, we are talking about actions. In response to Brinker's grip on his neck, Jean describes how, with a snap of the neck, I shook his hands off me, my teeth set. So we've introduced the quotation, we know who it's from, who is the recipient of this, and we know what the action is through this quotation. This action shows not only how uncomfortable Jean is with the situation, but also how defensive he feels. So we also have an explanation of what the quotation shows. The word snap suggests force and shows how violent his action is. So we've gone and zoomed in on a word here. So this is where I said to you, look at the quotation that you've chosen and think about which word stands out. So obviously this word is quite violent, quite aggressive. So this is the first word that we're going to comment on. It also reveals his paranoia and panic. So we have a link back to the question here, but we're also showing the examiner that we can continue our interpretation. We can include multiple layers here. Reveals his paranoia and panic as he's trying to evade not only Brinker's grasp, but also the forthcoming interrogation. This is further evidenced by Brinker's use of the word prisoner, which clearly makes Jean nervous. From this, it is clear that Jean desperately feels a need to escape, which is further demonstrated by the animalistic phrase, my teeth set. So notice how the decision's been made here to split this quotation into 2. So the pupil was right to do so. Snap of the neck is important, but also this phrase is important. If you do decide to talk about 2 aspects of the same quotation, try and do them one at a time. This phrase suggests he is preparing himself for a conflict and is becoming more defensive. So here we have an explanation of what the quotation shows. And again, this phrase here, this linking phrase in addition, shows that we're going to build upon this. In addition, this action is something we may see in an animal which is preparing to fight. So this is some fantastic interpretation of meaning, and it clearly shows a personal response to the language used here. Perhaps Knowles is trying to show the extent of Jean's fear as he's reverting to animalistic instincts as a means of self-defense. So there's some great analysis here and interpretation of meaning. Jean's actions here are swift and forceful and would thereby create tension in the enclosed space. So here we have the effect of this technique, and we have Knowles' intention here in terms of creating tension. However, Knowles also skillfully places the reader in a state of suspense as we feel the conflict rising between both Brinker and Jean, so we also have an effect here on the reader. In addition to showing Jean's defensiveness, this action also reminds us just how young the boys are and highlights the type of adolescent conflict that can occur whilst at school. So here we have some reference back to the context. So the context of the novel and the setting of the novel in terms of what Knowles is trying to show us about adolescence and the conflicts that can ensue and the effects that these have on teenagers. Okay, so here are some final tips. Hopefully from going through an example, you can see just how to structure your answer and also what needs to be included. So just some final tips in terms of what we've gone through and the skills that we have covered. Ensure you have clear points. Try and make sure these are in chronological order if possible. This also will help you hugely when you go back to the extract and you're trying to write your answer up in full. It can get very confusing if you've got 30 minutes and you're trying to read through this huge extract time and time again. Just make it easy for yourself. Highlight the quotations that you want and try and move through them in an order that suits you. Choose relevant and interesting quotations. If the quotations aren't interesting, if they don't have interesting vocabulary, or if there aren't many techniques for you to talk about, you're going to find it difficult to develop your interpretation and layer your response. Good use of keywords from the question or synonyms of the keywords in the question, just to try and keep yourself on track, but also to show the examiner that everything that you're saying is relevant. Name the techniques, but also analyse them. Simply naming techniques, as I mentioned, will not really garner you any more marks. Analyse any language choice. Zoom in on that one word that you think really stands out. Talk about the connotations and then link everything back to the question. Try and link back to Knowles' intention wherever possible, the effects that you think that he creates, and also link back to the effect on the reader, how you would feel or what you would understand or what you would even think about particular characters or relationships. Use context only if it supports and enhances your ideas. Remember, please do not bolt on dates or timelines. This isn't relevant unless it really supports a point that you're trying to make. And please try and use academic phrases to help you to develop your response. So suggests, reveals, implies, all of these can really help not only to structure your answer, but it forces you to develop your interpretation. It forces you to add something additional. So that's the end of this lesson today. Thank you very much for taking part. Please look out for the next lesson, which will be how to answer the full novel question. So today we've looked at the extract, and then the next lesson we'll look at the second question that you have an option from, which is the full novel. Thank you very much. Goodbye.